Hey everyone. In this last video for this week, I'm going to talk about a topic that we touched upon early on in this semester, namely linking survey data to other types of big data sources. Okay? And this brings us back again to our 3 eras of survey research, where in the time of big data, one important change compared to previous or traditional survey research methods is that the surveys are not necessarily standalone data collection efforts, but they can actually be linked to other types of data sources in order to provide additional information. Okay, and that's a huge change and huge opportunity for social scientists. Okay. And I'm going to talk through one of the another example of this type of linkage between survey data and other big data sources. But first off, more general from a conceptual perspective, it's important to distinguish two different types of linking survey data to big data. And in the bit by bit book, this is kind of described pretty well and distinguishes or the distinction is being made between what the author calls amplified asking and on the one hand and enriched asking, right? So what do we mean by amplified asking? By amplified asking, we mean combining basically collecting survey data and combining that limited survey data with digital trace data to estimate a model that basically helps us predict the survey responses, the outcome of interest that we measure in the survey, based on the available digital trace data. The idea is then, because the digital trace data is available for more observations than we had included in the survey itself, and then we can kind of use this digital trace data to impute the outcome, the survey data that we couldn't collect, and use that ultimately for research, right? So one of the examples that we talked about in the past was trying to predict poverty and wealth from mobile phone metadata in Rwanda. And I'm going to go back to that article in a second. So that's one example of amplified asking, where we combine an external big data source with survey data and then kind of learn the relationship between those two data sources in order to kind of impute outcomes that we measured in the survey for the remaining set for which we only have the digital trace data. Okay, so that's amplified asking on the one hand. Enriched asking on the other hand describes record linkage between survey data and digital trace data combined in order to answer social science research questions, right? And so one of the examples that we have here that I'm not going to talk about in the video, but that we're going to talk about in the Q&A session is the Guess et al. Paper on misinformation and Facebook usage, right? So that's an example where we have survey data and it's combined with additional big data sources, and that combination, that record linkage between these two types of data sources, that's what is used ultimately to answer social science questions, right? So both are important, but both are kind of structurally different in how we're using these additional data sources and linking them to survey data. Okay. So as I mentioned, one example for amplified asking that we talked about in the past was Blumenstock et al. 2015, predicting poverty and wealth from mobile phone metadata. Okay, and so I showed you in one of the first videos, I believe it was for the second week, I showed you kind of the structure of their research design, which used survey data as well as call records to kind of estimate a model that links features from the call records and survey data, where they actually ask people about their well, they were interested in poverty, but ultimately the way they measured it was by asking, for example, do you own a bicycle? Do you own a radio and things like that? And ultimately, those were the outcomes that they tried to that they wanted to predict as measures of wealth or poverty. Okay, um, and then they basically they were only able to collect limited amount of survey data, but by estimating this model and combining this with the call records, which were available for a much larger set of observations, they can ultimately impute these outcomes of interest for the remaining population. And by combining this with the residence location, they were actually able to provide um, accurate estimates of the distribution of wealth across regions. Okay, and as we said, this is kind of one prime example of this combination of ready-made big data sources that are available, like call records, for example, that are collected by phone providers, and custom-made surveys, and the combination of the two kind of provides new insights for social science researchers ultimately. Okay. And now I want to show you a different a different paper that kind of did something very similar, and also in the context of estimating poverty, but using slightly different data methods. Okay, and this paper is by Neil, Jean, and others, published in 2016, also in Science, and I will post this on Canvas as well, so you can take a look. It's a short paper, and it's really cool and really interesting. The title is Combining Satellite Imagery and Machine Learning to Predict Poverty, right? And so the idea here is to basically use satellite day pictures as well as nightlight pictures, the combination of the two, as well as available survey data, so surveys that have been administered not by the researchers themselves, but they were available, to estimate wealth in places without those specific surveys. Okay. And I think this is another really cool example of this basic idea of combining survey data with other additional kind of ready-made data sources to provide ultimately provide, in this case, provide a measure that at least at this fine-grained level would otherwise be way too costly to actually collect. Okay. So this is one of the graphs from the paper to go kind of through the logic, and I'm just going to talk about this briefly here. The overall idea is to use deep learning and specifically convolutional neural networks to kind of analyze these satellite images and predict economic activity. Okay. And specifically what they're using is daytime satellite photos, which capture details of the landscapes, as well as satellite night lights that are ultimately a proxy for economic activity. Because at night, as soon as you have kind of clusters of cities and lots of economic activity, you see that's easily identifiable in satellite pictures at night, because you see the lights and kind of proximity to these light clusters kind of are a proxy for proximity to economic centers ultimately. Okay. But previous studies have actually used these satellite nighttime pictures before in order to kind of estimate economic activity, or to estimate poverty, but they were not as accurate. The reason why they're not as accurate is that they're missing the information that we can get from these daytime satellite photos, because the daytime satellite photos can ultimately provide us information about the structure of the landscape and additional kind of regional information. Okay. So okay. So ultimately, what they're doing is they start with this CNN, the convolutional neural network, and they have a lot of training data. They have surveys in a couple of different countries in Africa, and so they have information on regional wealth, and they combine that with large amounts of satellite images, and then train this neural network to kind of extract the features that predict economic activity, and then take those features to train a ridge regression to predict cluster, ultimately predict kind of the mean survey responses in a specific regional cluster. Okay, and I guess one of the detailed differences between this paper and the Blumenstock paper was that in the Blumenstock paper, the way the features were extracted, and the way the features from these call records were kind of designed in the model was actually still done kind of manually by the researcher. Ultimately, what they did was they ran logistic regressions. They used the call records and kind of engineered certain features like call length or number of international calls and things like that, and location of the calls, and use those features then in a logistic regression, right? But that's kind of still there's still a kind of a researcher's there's still a large part of kind of the researchers selecting and identifying features that might be predictive of the outcome of interest, right? In this case, the number of features is much larger, and it's much harder to kind of from the images themselves, you can't a priori directly extract specific features, like length of a call or something like that, right? So that's where kind of deep learning comes in, and these convolutional neural networks, because they actually allow us, even with these like high dimensional data where we can't, manually extract specific features that we think should be predictive of economic activity or things like that. But these neural networks ultimately are able to kind of extract those features that are predictive of the outcome of interest in our training data. Okay. So this is one of the graphs from this paper where they're kind of comparing the predicted cluster level consumption in Nigeria, Tanzania, Uganda, and Malawi. And they're comparing, in this case, using cross-validation, and they're comparing basically the out-of-sample prediction based on their model with the actual observed survey-based consumption in those specific areas. Okay, and we can see that they're positively correlated, and the R square ranges between 0.37 and 0.55. Okay, so there's a pretty good, strong relationship between their prediction and the actual observed kind of level of consumption based on the survey data. Okay. Another thing they can they look at is basically the kind of cross-border model generalization. So they can train these models for each individual country, and then can examine to what extent the model that is based or that was trained in one country allows you to predict wealth in another country, right? And so, of course, the kind of predictive in this diagonal, we see kind of this R square, or the predictive accuracy within when the model is trained for a country and then evaluated on the same country. And in the off diagonal, we see basically how a model that is based on one country is still able to predict economic activity in another country. And of course, as soon as the geography is very different, or the the baseline economic activity and things like that are very different, then this predictive accuracy becomes lower and lower. Okay. So I think this is a really interesting paper, and because we talked about Blumenstock before as this like great example of combining ready-made and custom-mades, I think kind of this gene paper is an kind of really interesting additional example that combines multiple ready-made, so these satellite pictures, both daytime pictures and nighttime pictures, and quasi custom-made, so additional survey data that was actually already collected in these countries. So they didn't have their own, they didn't run their own surveys in these countries, but they used available survey data to ultimately estimate something, or I mean, ultimately, the goals of inference are similar in the Blumenstock paper and in the Gene paper, in the sense that they're both interested in estimating poverty in African countries, but they do this by relying on very different types of data sources. And ultimately, these different strategies have different strengths and weaknesses. And so maybe for you to think about for now, and maybe we can talk about this a little bit more in the Q&A, are to kind of think about what the strengths and weaknesses of both approaches are, and where advantages and disadvantages lie of either of those approaches. And more generally, for you to think about kind of as a conclusion, what the role for individual researchers is collecting data in this age of ready-mades and quasi-custom-mades, right? So to what extent, what is the role for individual researchers when there's a lot of ready-made data already available, and a lot of kind of survey data is also available? To what extent, under which circumstances do we need additional survey data, and how can we actually collect these data? And then more generally, given given that a lot of governments collect large general purpose data sets, for example, census data and things like that, another important question to kind of think about is how should governments collect these large general purpose data sets if they will be combined with ready-mades, right? So on the one hand, both to allow social science research on the one hand, but also, I mean, there might be potential problems and issues that might develop related to privacy and things like that. Okay. So that's all for this week. I'll upload all those papers, so feel free to check them out if you find them interesting, and then we'll chat about them more in the Q&A session next week.